The age of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were among the darkest periods in human history, spanning from the 16th to the 19th century. The slave trade was a complex network of trade routes, involving the transportation of African slaves from their homeland to the Americas, Europe, and the Middle East. The trade had a profound impact on global history, and its legacy can still be felt today. The transatlantic slave trade began in the early 16th century, following the arrival of the Portuguese in West Africa. European traders, who were initially interested in African gold and ivory, soon discovered the lucrative slave trade. They began to capture Africans and transport them to the Americas, where they were sold as slaves to work on plantations, mines, and other industries. At first, the slave trade was limited in scale, but it grew rapidly over time. The demand for slaves in the Americas, especially in Brazil and the Caribbean, fueled the expansion of the trade. European powers, including Britain, France, and Spain, established colonies in the Americas, and the slave trade became an essential component of their economies. African slaves were transported in horrific conditions, packed tightly into ships and subjected to disease, malnutrition, and abuse. Many died during the voyage, and those who survived were often sold into brutal slavery. The impact of the slave trade on Africa was catastrophic, leading to the depopulation of some regions, the disruption of local economies, and the loss of millions of lives. In the Americas, the slave trade had a profound impact on the development of societies and economies. The labor of African slaves was crucial in building the economies of the British and French colonies in the Caribbean, as well as the southern United States. Slave labor was used to produce sugar, tobacco, cotton, and other crops that were exported to Europe and other parts of the world. The conditions under which slaves lived and worked were appalling. They were subjected to brutal punishments, including whipping and branding, and their families were often separated. Slaves were treated as property rather than people, and their basic human rights were ignored. Resistance to slavery was widespread, and many slaves rebelled against their owners. Slave revolts, such as the Haitian Revolution, were bloody and brutal, and they played an essential role in the eventual abolition of slavery. The efforts of abolitionists, such as William Wilberforce and Harriet Tubman, also contributed to the end of the slave trade. The abolition of the slave trade was a long and difficult process that spanned several decades. The first significant steps towards abolition were taken in Britain in the late 18th century, with the passage of the Slave Trade Act of 1807, which made it illegal to transport slaves. However, slavery itself was not abolished until the 1830s. The legacy of the slave trade can still be felt today. The social, economic, and cultural impact of slavery on the Americas and Africa is immense, and its effects are still being felt. Slavery has left a lasting legacy of racism, discrimination, and inequality that continues to affect people around the world. In conclusion, the age of slavery and the transatlantic slave trade were among the darkest periods in human history. The trade had a profound impact on global history, and its legacy can still be felt today. The transatlantic slave trade was a complex network of trade routes, involving the transportation of African slaves from their homeland to the Americas, Europe, and the Middle East. The trade had a devastating impact on Africa, and it fueled the economies of the British and French colonies in the Caribbean, as well as the southern United States. The conditions under which slaves lived and worked were appalling, and the resistance to slavery played a crucial role in its eventual abolition.